130 or so. Keith, do you want to take it away?
Keith, you might be muted.
Keith is stuck in another network without a gateway to get here.
I'll ping him on team. Oh, he can't hear anybody. So I guess it goes both ways.
And now I can hear people. I went the entire first part of that meeting without hearing a single thing. The only thing that clued me in, the fact that things might have been kicking off, is that I heard the recording sound start. So that was really.
Well, we were just making fun of you, so you didn't miss out on too much. But we were saying that you can go ahead and start talking about whatever you want to talk about here.
Sure. All right. So yeah, this doc is originally written by John and some others from Solo from earlier this year. I sort of copied it into a new doc, cleaned up most of the comments, and started to try to readdress the conversation. This is part of the GA task for Ambient, for Ambient to kind of have confidence in the future proofing of the H-bone protocol, as well as other things for multi-cluster, multi-network use cases. I tried to keep this intentionally scoped down. I put the intended scope here at the top. For the doc, if you see something that's not in that that is not in that scope or is deferred, it shouldn't be there. So let me know and I can remove it. So general scope for this that I'm trying to get approval on from the community are the following 3 points. That double H-bone will be the encapsulation mechanism for multi-network, multi-cluster. We would need to support at least service addressing, a specific encoding of a service, as well as pod IP and subset addressing are going to be deferred for the future. But I think from an MVP perspective, we can get away with just service addressing. And then we reserve the right, this sort of gets into the specific encodings of service addressing, but we reserve the right to add hostname / SNI in the future. Then that's the third point, actually. So the door to SNI pass-through stays open in the future if latency is problematic for power users or users who are especially latency sensitive. I want to try to avoid reading the entire doc, but generally, as far as goals go, the general spirit of this is we want to minimize as much special casing as we can. We want to make sure it's secure. We're not exposing things unintentionally. We want to support use cases where each control plane doesn't understand everything. So sort of true segmented traffic or segmented control plane visibility. We've got a point here for interrupt with legacy MTLS and H-bone in the same mesh. This was on the original doc. I'm not sure. I guess if you had an existing East-West gateway, you might want to reuse that, but that's sort of a lower tier goal, in my opinion. Any changes to client and server being reasonable to implement in both zTunnel and Envoy. So not too much configuration on the Envoy side, and as well as being able to fit within WBS from the zTunnel side. And then following internet standards as closely as possible. And that last one is going to be a topic of concern, I think, for a decent bit of this. So that's the kind of high level description. Let me come over here and see if there are questions. Okay, just like John and then Costin. John, you go first.
Yeah, I believe you said your goal was at least to get approval on the scope, so I'll start there. I think it makes sense. I mean, the last one is just saying that we can make changes in the future. It's always a good stance to have. The first one, I guess it could be controversial, but we've kind of all agreed on it for many years as the high level way to do it. So it's not controversial as well. And the service addressing, I agree with that as well. So yeah, I think this is good. It aligns with everything we've talked about with others as well on this topic. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
So,
I-
go ahead, Costin.
No, about the same thing. I mean, it's mostly reasonable. I think the last one that you mentioned, which is standard compliance, should probably be the first one. I mean, it's the most important or kind of strict requirement. And that also implies that we should be able to support any standard compatible compliant, load balancer or gateway or whatever it is, as long as it follows the protocol. And I don't see anything in this proposal that makes it incompatible. I mean, as long as service naming is supported and it's using standard SNI, I think it's perfectly viable and work with anyone. And the dual HBON, it's maybe just an implementation details that we use in some cases, but the outer bound is the outer ATLS is the one that is relevant for a standard-based proxy.
Yeah, agreeing with that. Like the fact that the inner part is also HBON is irrelevant. Like if you stuck
It's irrelevant, yes.
Cloudflare as I don't know if Cloudflare can do this, but just some arbitrary thing, like it doesn't care. It's just an opaque blob that is going to be processed.
It's an opaque blob, exactly. You can pass SSH, for example, over the tunnel. I mean, it is basically an outer tunnel that is specified in the east-west gateway specification, and then it forward streams that needs to be understood end to end, but they are completely irrelevant from that point on because you don't have access to the keys. You cannot decode. You don't even know what is inside. And yes, if it goes to another Z tunnel, it is probably going to be able.
Yeah.
It sounds like here we're talking about the difference between like a compliance specification, which is that outer TLS must always happen, and the implementation detail of how we will carry out multi-cluster, which is that there will be an inner MTLS that provides effectively an end-to-end encryption via.
Of course. But from a point of view of a gateway, they operate on the outer standard thing. And I think it is critical for success to have compatibility, have strict compatibility. So you should be able to pick up Nginx, Apache, Tomcat, or whatever, plop it there, and it would work. That's kind of as long as it works, everything else is perfect.
Yeah, one thing that might clarify things a bit is that there's actually really three components here: the client, the gateway, and the server. It's only the client that needs to be aware that double HBON is occurring. The gateway only handles the outer HBON, and the destination only handles the inner one. So.
Yep. And if I can add one more thing, it would be nice if regular waypoints would follow the same protocol, the same model as east-west, but that's kind of a nice thing to have.
If that's one of the open questions I have as far as implementation. So I backing up right quick. Hopefully the scope is uncontroversial. It's designed and minimized in order to try to make it uncontroversial. So if we can get some approval, so TOC members, if you can thumbs up the scope, that'll be super helpful because if we're all agree there, we can move forward and talk about some of the details, which we're already starting to do. As far as one of the things I wanted to call out, though, which was discussed when it comes to the inner payload, is that we have to be careful from a project perspective of if the inner payload is not HBON, to say that we don't make any guarantees about the security of or the authorization of that inner payload. So, for example, with HBON, we validate that the Z tunnel is going to check the client cert of the inner HBON payload. If somebody's just tunneling regular SNI, then that's a different security boundary in my mind, right? Because the east-west gateway and the client have trust, but then from the east-west gateway to then send that payload to the server, we don't know what the server is going to do if it's not HBON. So I think it's at least a different claim of authorization from a project perspective.
I think the east-west gateway responsibility is just the same as any gateway to authenticate and apply policies based on the external authentication. just like if you make an HTTP request. Obviously, it does a regular HTTP gateway does not make any guarantees that the HTTP or whatever it's in the payload of the message has any properties. It's just applying policies based on strong identity of the outer connection. And then the inner connection may provide an additional layer of encryption, 2 layer of encryption, 5 layer of encryption. But the difference from the current east-west gateway, which is just completely blind, not authenticated, doesn't make any guarantee at all, cannot apply policies. We are moving to a model where the gateway, the east-west gateway, can apply policy and is trusted.
Yep. I agree.
So the issue, the CVE, the security disclosure that is linked in the goals, I wasn't part of the project during then. If I'm understanding the two of you correct, I think I looked at the doc for the disclosure briefly, but was the issue there that we weren't validating the okay, so
the problem is there's no validation. So you can go from public internet all the way to the back end with no validation at any point in the way. Wait,
we didn't do encrypt. We didn't check the client cert at the east-west gateway.
We cannot.
And we still do
cannot because
yeah, what we do now is we check that the ALPN matches the EAST2 ALPN, and we match that we think the destination is going to look at the ALPN and realize it's TLS and reject it if not. But it's a little fuzzy. What we have double H1 is strictly better because the gateway actually authenticates that it's a real certificate. And then if the destination wants to authenticate that the inside is also encrypted, obviously can do that as well with its own policies.
That's not the dual MTLS. What it is that the east-west gateway is actually doing security.
Sure, it doesn't have to be
being
double
a
H1, but it has to be terminating the TLS. You could,
The external TLS is on it.
Yeah, that's the difference. It's that before it was SNI pass through, and we just sort of did routing and patch it through regardless. But now with double H, because you've got the outer encapsulation, we can actually apply policy to make sure that we trust that mesh client or what have you. Okay, I'm with you now. That makes sense. Okay.
And for the record, I don't think the LPN checks and the other things that we're doing are good, better than nothing. But I'm not entirely sure that an attacker that knows what it's doing cannot reproduce the same kind of traffic we check. And if you have the destination that is not EAST2 aware, you can still probably bypass it. I mean, it's good enough until we get the new stuff out with the real TLS on the outer bound, but I have my doubts.
And did we do pass through just so the east-west gateway never is able to read the payload? And for performance, is that the motivation for why we don't?
Convenience hack. It was not necessarily completely security reviewed properly.
Okay. Because I guess that's one of my was one of the questions in the previous version of the doc is it acceptable for the east-west gateway to be able to read the payload? I like to continue the idea that it doesn't because it just feels fuzzier and nicer. But
keep in mind the difference too is that it's who the client sees. Sorry, Costin. Who the client sees the request from. So there is a mode where you could have a trusted east-west gateway, and maybe we could offer that. And this is like what Linkerd does or did or something. And I say did because they at least were looking at exploring other options where then you have to have all your policies trust the east-west gateway, right? And you don't know who the original source was. So it's not just that they can see the payload, right, gotcha. It's also that then they have to re-encrypt it and you've lost the end-to-end identity. I mean, you could pass it through some other thing like a header or something, like there's options, but it still becomes like this trusted component versus an untrusted component.
And the trust and untrust is a very depends on your requirements. If you are customers that have strong requirements, that the boundary is not only trusted, but it's required by law or whatever regulations to inspect and not allow arbitrary traffic and look at actual payload and does not allow, kind of tunnels from inside to outside to exfiltrate data. And there are customers where the east-west gateway is required to not be able to inspect the data. Both of them are, required, and a customer may choose one or a customer may choose the other one. The good news is that for the first case, the regular gateway solves the problem. And you have plain text, and that's why I'm saying double MTLS, double HBON may not be a strong requirement. I mean, in some cases, you are required in the east-west gateway to look at the data.
Yeah, I would say that if you're, I mean, we could have different modes, but my at least initial
do.
bid would be that if you're in that case, you may be better off using just a standard ingress gateway or waypoint, and then having the east-west gateway be just a dumb pass-through. Go to the waypoint that does the more advanced checks. So we have a
That's
lot
what I was saying, John, as well.
into
Yep.
architecture. Yeah.
A regular gateway is the other case. I mean, a regular gateway
Yeah.
with internal IP or with some extra protections, but still following the.
Yeah, and waypoint's really just going east-west and then east ingress gateway if you don't want multiple IPs or something. I don't know. You could just have one entry point. So a lot of options people can do.
Awesome. So it looks like Lynn and John are both thumbs up. Mitch and Louis, and then Raj for watching the recording. Take a look at the scope and let me know if you have any questions or issues. If not, look forward to giving directional approval on this. Let me see if there's any other agenda because I don't want to take all the time if there's other things people want to talk about.
Louis,
but
by
there
the
are-
way, you go to the document to thumbs up, not here. So that it's
No, I
recorded.
was just reacting to the Keith asking me to follow up.
Okay, cool.
Just to clarify
Yeah.
though, Louis, what we're asking is just sign up on these 3 sentences. So
Yeah, the scope. Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, Keith.
Yeah, no problem. It looks like there's no other topics. If folks have the time or might like to discuss it, I have some open questions for us to discuss. Some of it is just me improving my understanding of how things work in single cluster, so we can extrapolate those to multi-cluster. Others are about sort of generic, some of the control plane service discovery aspects to this, and happy to discuss some of those open questions if folks are so inclined.
So should we discuss the goals, or do you? Is the goals already been like approved or anything?
The goals are more like a collection of guiding principles for the upcoming design. If folks have strong opinions about the goals where there might not be requirements, or we should loosen them or strengthen some of them, then yeah, we can do that, and that might give us some more flexibility potentially, or in some cases lessen the flexibility of the eventual design. What I've got in the doc is sort of an initial proposal that I'm sure we will iterate on. Like I mentioned, there are some open questions there. In my mind, the goals don't really need approval. It's just more of, hey, do we generally agree that these are the guiding principles that we want to keep in mind for the design?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I guess my only question on the goal is the requirements for interrupt, since we haven't have interrupt as a high item on the agenda. And also, I don't fully understand your last goal. I guess I don't quite understand what does it mean.
Sure. And do you mean the last goal? Now that
Any
John removed
change to
the
client server reasonable? Do you refer to the sidecar and ambient mode interrupt too?
Oh, no. So the one about reasonable changes, that's more about, in my mind, the XDS. Keeping in mind that Envoy and zTunnel have 2 different sets of XDS APIs. We want to make sure that whatever we design is reasonable to implement in whichever set of XDS APIs, whether it's WDS or the Envoy formal XDS.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
And then the interrupt question, the main question there is that maybe if like with legacy MTLS where you've got an existing Istio ingress gateway, or sorry, Istio east-west gateway, where it's doing ALPN based routing to, as John mentioned.
Did kids drop off or?
yeah, While we're waiting, Mitch, you had that question at the beginning. Anything you need? Keith messaged me, said he'll be right back. Anyhow, yeah, did that answer your question or any other things we want to clarify here?
Hey,
Mitch, you're
Keith, are
muted.
you back?
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't restart my browser in time to get all the security updates, so
Okay.
it was made to restart randomly. Oh my goodness, not a great day for IT for me today. What was I saying? Oh, legacy HBone. Yeah, so our legacy MTLS. So that's more to capture the requirement that, hey, maybe if we are doing migrations and somebody's got an existing east-west gateway, then maybe they can use HBone, or where they've got multi-cluster with both ambient and sidecar style of multi-cluster, where they can use LPN hacks as well as double HBone. Like I said, I think I'm less persuaded by that goal in particular, mainly because I think if you're going to be doing any ambient interrupt, you're going to be supporting HBone to begin with, and so sidecars who are doing multi-network should just start doing double HBone because it's strictly better. And I don't think that the migration case has been really prioritized community-wise, so less inclined by that one. But hopefully that answers your question, Lynn.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what I'm thinking too, because we don't necessarily even support this within the same cluster for sidecar to ambient between legacy mutual TLS and HBone. So I'm a little bit worried to have it as a goal for multi-cluster, multi-network.
Maybe it's a stretch goal or something. I'm a little bit skeptical as well, but I'm not decided, I would say, but it's definitely the prospect of doing double HBone in Envoy is unappealing, as is doing single HBone, as is doing anything. But that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't ever do it. But it would be great to make progress and with that.
I kind of disagree with John here. I think if the trade-off is between keeping things simple and understandable and clean, and having this feature, I would much rather prefer to keep them simple and clean. I mean, if a vendor does crazy things to support migration, that's wonderful, good for them. But I would prefer that we have a clean path and we don't have all the legacy complexity and craziness and stuff kind of moved into the new world.
Costin, I mean, if we have two choices here, right? Like if we want the property of termination and authentication in the east-west gateway, right, then we have an inner and an outer. And then we have to choose a protocol, right, to implement as a project, or at least one, right, to enable things to communicate.
It's a new one.
Right, and
so new protocol, new words, and the old one, it's still working. We are not breaking it, but I don't think we should complicate the new world and add complexity for the sake of keeping the old world alive.
Right. Yes, but if the explicit goal is like we have to do double HBone and make that work in Envoy to solve one of those problems, right? We expect that to be painful. We've seen HBone be painful in Envoy already. So we're just going to be cognizant of that.
Yep.
Because waypoints can also be clients, right? In theory, I believe.
But you don't have to. I mean, it's possible to just not use Envoy, use Ambient if you choose to, or use Envoy the old style east-west gateway, which is not deprecated or going away. Or you can choose to have the sandwich for sidecars. There are plenty of ways that avoid the ugly stuff that you mentioned.
Yeah, we just like I just said, just have to be cognizant of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sean mentioned he had to leave in I think now like 3 minutes or so. So I wanted to ask one question to the group, just for my own understanding. With the whole SEO, like use waypoints labeling um, scheme, how do we? What's the more intuitive way for that to work in multi-cluster? So you have kind of two options in my mind. Either use waypoints and you put a gateway name, will send the traffic to the local waypoint first and then do load balancing to a remote pod, or use waypoints could also has the client tunnel send to a remote waypoint that we expect to exist in the remote cluster because I don't know, because namespace sameness or what have you. I know a big goal of Ambient is to try to undo a lot of the cluster local, not being local semantics that we have. So that latter one feels really confusing to me. Feels like it wouldn't match that goal. But I'm curious as to what folks think would be intuitive here.
Well, I think there's a big difference between intuitive and practical, Keith. Remote waypoint, or sorry, client local waypoint with endpoint in remote network, right, requires the discovery of the endpoint in the remote network to complete addressing. So your scope, support for at least service addressing, right, is going to run counter to goal number one, or like your flavor number one, right?
Not
Like
not
those two things
necessarily, right? If what if the waypoint knows to send to an east-west gateway, that would do the load balancing. It wouldn't necessarily be super practical, but it would not be possible to do
Right. So
tunnel.
then you're basically saying skip the remote waypoint, but I'm just going to do L4 load balancing. I don't know anything about connection diversity in the backend.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So that, like, there's obviously pros and cons of both, but like there are difficulties with either, right? And what you expect to get out of your L7 load balancer. Like would the near waypoint know that it should open multiple connections to the east-west gateway to get connection diversity, for instance, for L7 load balancing purposes?
Right.
Right. Yeah. So that's the problem space.
Yeah, I mean, the happy case is if there's a local waypoint, you send to it, and then it goes. And if there's no local waypoint, you send through the east-west gateway, and it potentially sends to the waypoint in the remote cluster. The unhappy case is you send to the local waypoint, but there's no local endpoint. So now what do? You either have to, now the waypoint itself is the one that has to go across network, and it's already gone through the waypoint. So do we go through both waypoints? Do we drop it? Do we somehow skip the remote one? Those are things that's the tricky case in my mind.
Yeah. So speaking probabilistically, there's more likely to be a waypoint where the endpoints are, where the destinations are. Right. Let's say you had two clusters. A was in, half of workloads were in the A cluster, and the other half of the workloads in the B cluster. You'd expect the waypoints for the workloads in the B cluster to be in the B cluster, and maybe not for the waypoints for the B workloads to be in the B cluster. Right, there's that kind of gravity effect, and that will line up with people's deployments and CI/CD processes.
What about the? I mean, so does that match the typical namespace sameness approach that we see with multi-cluster, where you essentially have one large, logically one large cluster, but spread across multiple physical Kubernetes clusters because of cloud provider regions or what have you. There you might have multiple, and the happy path is we prefer local, but the local endpoints might all be unhealthy. So do we know, is there a way for us to know not to send to that local waypoint into kind of short circuit, or do we have to go through that local waypoint first?
No, in theory, there's no correlation from the front end and the back end. So you can't get traffic to a service and say that service has no local backend, so I don't need the waypoint, because the waypoint could be saying, I'm going to take all these services and I'm going to send all the traffic to google.com, for example. The backend is irrelevant for a service waypoint, obviously. So that's the tricky part.
Yeah. Okay. So the hop is required. Okay.
Yep.
So we're really not. So that's the other issue with our concern with double H bone performance wise is that now we're not talking about just one layer of encapsulation. You're talking about multiple hops in addition to potentially like well, no, the double H bone part only happening once, but in the scheme of the entire mesh, it could be. It's not just Z tunnel east west gateway to waypoint. It could be Z tunnel waypoint, double H bone east west gateway, terminate outer to the inner waypoint. So now you've got multiple.
So the other thing
we
like I don't like. I think we do have to avoid double waypoint, right? Right. That one we have to be particularly careful about. Right, like double policy enforcement is a bug waiting to happen.
True.
So it's one of the two paths, right? It's either client east-west gateway, remote waypoint, remote endpoint, or it's client local waypoint, east-west gateway, remote endpoint. And yes, figuring out how to choose between those two when both are present will require some thought.
Yeah. I was unknowingly like it would be great if, for example, the local Z tunnel could know about the endpoints behind the service front end and make an intelligent decision. But we can't. So we have to. The waypoint essentially has to be that to logically be part of the same deployment of waypoints. What cluster you sit in doesn't matter. You're part of the same waypoint fleet logically, and so you get all the policy regardless of what cluster you sit in.
Right.
Am I thinking about that right?
Mostly. I think we need to write it down.
Fair enough. Okay, this gives me a good enough set of things to go on. I will work on some of these edge cases and document them. The last thing I want to just throw out and not necessarily talk about a bunch, but wanted to put on people's minds is that the way that this works with MCS API could be very interesting because potentially, like if you imagine a very stripped down Istio MCS implementation where we're not an MCS controller, we're just reading, potentially doing server-side apply for service imports in the local cluster. And if we can somehow annotate those service imports to point to east-west gateway, then we could delegate some of that service discovery, some of the service discovery needs to some extent. But I haven't thought that one through yet, and probably it's better for that to be its own design doc because our MCS API support needs an overhaul. But wanted to, if folks had strong opinions on MCS API, please reach out. We'd love to discuss. I know Mike Morris has been doing a lot of work upstream and changing the MCS API. So something that's kind of in the back of my mind. But if you've got some thoughts, we'd love to discuss.
Has the general perceived frustrations with the MCS API being resolved from UX perspective? Right, if you look in Istio today, right, you can use service entry and point it at a thing and say that's a service. Largely achieve the same effect, right? If you point at a service entry at an east-west gateway. So there's that, and then there's the notion of the value, or whether you consider namespace sameness to be a pattern or an anti-pattern. Right, an MCS went a long way out of its way to make namespace sameness an anti-pattern, when we regularly hear from customers that namespace sameness is a desirable pattern.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, MCS requires namespace sameness.
It doesn't actually, because it allows you to allocate names, Mike. Right. nor does it actually leverage the fact that namespace sameness exists, right? It requires the export and the import to be symmetric. It allows you for name allocation. And so it doesn't allow people to short circuit any of the assumptions if they use it as the UX for the actual UX that they use to describe the intent. Right? Or do they treat MCS as an infrastructural API and like write abstraction layers on top of it to achieve that effect?
Yeah, I think I'm confused by the critique here because MCS definitely has an explicit assumption of all clusters in a cluster set require namespace sameness, and the entire like assumptions of like where a controller would create service imports based on service export definition, it requires that namespace sameness assumption, because if it doesn't, then a whole bunch of things start to fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, there are other issues, but if namespace sameness is assumed, right, the only function that,
Yes.
like, the only valuable API, right, is the publish subscribe verb, right, saying this cluster namespace, sorry, this cluster's service is exported, and then other clusters saying this cluster's service is imported, right?
Yes.
And they don't really need to share the endpoints, right? They could have just declared that. And the infrastructure could have taken care of that part for them.
Yes. That is a model that I think that's part of what I want to like take another look at Istio's MCS implementation to see, like, kind of aligned with what Keith was saying. If Istio can do less, and what it looks like to layer Istio over top of an infrastructure implementation that is handling those inputs.
Right. Carsten?
Yeah, sorry, I have had another short meeting in between this meeting. But I want to emphasize that authority pod IP, I don't necessarily agree that it's conformal to the standard, at least for the outer layer. And we should use the service name and FQDN and the normal domain SNI instead of pod IP. That's my. I know it's surprisingly controversial, but that's how most servers work. I don't know any existing servers that works with pod IPs in those days.
So if a pod is a member of multiple services, how do we solve that, Carsten?
So if you are talking with a service, there is absolutely no case where an IP will be used because nobody has enough IPs for everyone. For services, I mean, and if it is a pod is part of multiple services, that still, if you send the traffic to that service, you send the traffic. I mean, it's not necessarily a pod IP doesn't solve this problem of pod being part of multiple services. So you either talk with a service and since the waypoint is doing load balancing and its own stuff, unless it's using sticky session, which is a different case, or you're talking directly to a pod, in which case maybe you can use a pod IP, maybe you can use FQDN, I don't know. But for service, at least, I cannot imagine a case of not using the service FQDN and using the service IP, which may be even different. And
okay, I think I misunderstood. Authority pod IP means destination pod IP, not origin. Yes. Okay.
It's always authority is always a destination. Yes, authority is destination, and then the source it's in forwarded for.
Okay. In that case, that would make sense. Well, like, actually, I'm looking at this diagram here that we've got up on the screen, and I'm not sure what pod we would be talking about because the client service is not aware of destination pods. That's part of the whole point of the design. So would that be the east-west gateway pod?
I think this is probably referring to the pod using the east-west gateway for pod-to-pod communication, direct pod-to-pod, not pod-to-service. So probably it will be the service IP instead of pod IP if you're talking to service. I don't know. I mean, that's okay. A bit weird for me.
So Keith, we can take a note. We need to tighten this up in terms of specificity.
Yep, good call. The diagram is from an old, the older doc. where because I don't even think direct pod IP addressing works in east-west gateways today. So yeah, I can make a change to the image and make sure that that says service IP. It's a good catch.
Thank you.
Probably want to add a to-do for stateful set and then say you're not doing it.
Yeah, so that's part of the scope where pod IP, direct pod addressing is. Oh, you're talking about like headless services essentially and direct endpoints. Gotcha. Yep.
And it doesn't, like, as Carsten has repeatedly pointed out, it doesn't have to mean IPs, right, to have stateful addressing.
Yep. I put something there just quick to and I'll expound upon it later. And I'll add a comment to the diagram to make sure it says service IP. Cool. Well, I think that's everything I've got. Does anybody else have something they'd like to add to this topic or a new topic they'd like to discuss? All right. I guess we can give folks 15 minutes back then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, so. Yes.